Let's talk solutions. One caveat, you do not have to employ any of these. These are processes that I've found in my practice that help, and I use some much more than others. So consider these tools, time-tested tools, but not rules. The first solution comes in the form of outlining. When I'm in the room with folks, I like to get a show of hands for how many people use outlining for any part of the writing process. No need, obviously, for that today, but when I teach the outlining workshop at the American Medical Writers Conference, 1/3 of the room love outlining. 1/3 become nauseated by the prospect of using outlines, and the folks in the middle want to keep an open mind, but they've never really found success. My hope for today is that you are among the open-minded folks who might find a new way to use outlines. Now, you might be familiar with this process of writing. And of course, we can outline before the first draft, as we learned in what, 7th grade? You might remember learning a hierarchical structure with all the Roman numerals and indentations. We can also outline during the editing process. Let's see what that looks like. This comes in the form of what's known as a reverse outline. I suspect some folks might be familiar with this idea. This is how we can analyze the structure of the work, either in an article that you want to model things after or in something that you've written. You find all the periods first, and then you break up each sentence into its own line. Then you can rearrange the information so the flow makes more sense. One of the things that I do in my in-depth writing courses is working with reverse outlines. All the participants submit a writing sample in advance, and then I find a couple of paragraphs, separate out each sentence into its own line, print them out, cut them into strips, put them in an envelope, give each participant some tape and their respective envelope, and then they go through all the individual sentences and figure out in what order they would like to present the information. Then they go back to their writing sample and see if it matches, and if it's different, and how they might shorten their sentences. This works great if you're a kinesthetic learner. The good news is you can also do the same process on screen in MS Word. Once you have a better flow of information, you can recraft the language. You might have more paragraphs, you might have fewer. You'll certainly catch some redundancies. Cut and paste in Word works great. Many people have built careers using that feature. But I like the kinesthetic piece, printing out the sentences and rearranging them with our hands, because we are always looking at screens. We're always thinking about the words and the order, using our brains in the same way. We want to interrupt that way of thinking. And I'm sure this seems time-consuming and quite granular, but if you can't wrap your mind around what's going on or what's wrong with the flow of information, reverse outlining can sort that out. Let's talk a little more about outlining in advance. This is where we can start to speed up those ever tight timelines. As one could imagine, outlining is really useful in pre-writing. We've probably done this before at some point in our lives, right? In this context, though, the outlining I'm describing is not the truncated Roman numeral, next level capital letter format. That's way too generic and frankly unhelpful. When I think about useful outlining, I'm talking about germinating ideas using full sentences, not just single words. I'll pull out the ideas as full sentences from the source material and reference as I go. If you really want to make editors and the fact checkers happy, not only reference as you go, but also annotate as you go. Organize the information as you collect it, figure out what you want to include and what you don't, then rewrite the sentences after you organize the flow of information. Don't start wordsmithing until you have the flow of ideas. Establish the flow first. The best thing about using full sentences in an outline is that all you have to do is get rid of the outline structure and you have your first draft, referenced and annotated even. Now, some of you already know this and use outlines when you're drafting documents. Outlines can, again, really free up some of the brain work and shorten timelines. Outlines are great for sharing the wealth and sharing the mundanity. I'll call it the equal opportunity delegation tool. You write this great section, so I'll write this other great section. You write that boring part, and I'll write this boring part. Another way to look at this is that you'll have in writing what you agreed to in a defined order. And if you need one, the table of contents will already also be written. Outlines are also terrific for overcoming writer's block. It's about finding what's hot in the outline, what inspires you today. And it gets rid of the linearity in tackling a project. On a big project, you might not feel like you're able to write everything in sequence. If you're tired or if you don't have a lot of time, but you want to get something written today, start with a section of the outline that compels you or that is filled in enough to begin writing. If you have an outline, you can write any section and know how it will fit with the other sections that you're planning to include. And you don't have to spend the brain space to remember what you want to write more about, because it will be in the outline. And using the outline for editing is the unsung hero among both outlining proponents and editors. With an outline, you have a built-in checklist. You can easily see which sections still need work. Compare the latest draft to the original outline to make sure that the draft has moved in the intended direction and that all points have been covered. And I don't mean to suggest that outlines should remain static throughout this process. Quite the contrary. As with any writing, your outline may shift. But if you meant to cover something important that has gotten edited out, remember, you might be writing on a team, the outline serves as an objective reminder of what was agreed upon at the beginning of the process. And nobody has to play the bad guy. It's right there in writing. Outlines are a great way to facilitate discussion when used well. And I know you've got some questions. I was going to have you use the chat feature, but I don't think I can access it because I'm kind of doing this all by myself, folks. So we will open up for questions a little later. So just kind of make a note of those, and thanks for sticking around. I definitely want to answer your questions later. So now, because you saw this in the title, edit, I'm sure you wondered if I was actually going to talk about editing. Enough with the cognitive psychope. Okay, well, the next up are some ways that I approach editing, and I suspect that many of you use these conventions too. In scientific writing, and in most writing, honestly, I see an overuse of two infinitive verbs and their forms. To be, so is, are, was, were, has been, have been, etc., and to do. Of course, do, done, and did. They're easy. We use them all the time when we speak. Even in this talk, I don't even want to count how many times I've used these verbs. But writing is not speaking. Writing is more formal and should reflect structured thought, not simple reaction to someone else's speech. Regarding these two verbs, we use to be because we're used to it. I just used it then. We are used to it. It sneaks into every sentence. Simply, we need to cut that out. And I'll show you how in a minute. Do happens when we don't know what other word to use. Folks write they did the experiments or they did the data entry. And this is not untrue, but it's pedestrian. Folks worry about sounding too fancy, but imagine if they could perform the experiments and enter the data. We're committing to something here. If nothing else, we're committing to thinking like a writer. And you don't need to break out the thesaurus. We We don't want to confuse folks. We want our writing to be understandable to others. We don't need to impress anybody. We don't have to wax literary. We have the luxury of many fantastic verbs in English. So get your thoughts down in the early drafts. But when you give your draft another pass, when you edit it, look for ways to change up the verbs. And don't get me wrong, there are times when to be and to do are appropriate. We use them all the time in speech, but writing is not speaking, and neither is singing. Because my family is loaded with architects, I feel compelled to offer the now cliched quote from Mies van der Rohe when it comes to writing. Perhaps more relevant to those of us who work in scientific communications, I have to conjure Albert Einstein. After all, we do need to specify when something might be clinically significant, even if it's not statistically significant. Put another way, just 'cause is not a solid argument. Flesh out your writing, but no need for overkill. My earliest writing mentor, who gave me my first proofreading job when I was 19, on my last day, before I went off to spend the rest of the summer as a camp counselor, he took me aside and said, "Never use articles." That's a, an, and the. This piece of wisdom changed my life. He said there is always a more specific pronoun. After all, articles are pronouns, in case you forgot about diagramming sentences in 8th grade. So, knowing this, what do we change them to? Well, because we're in the middle of a grammar lesson, I might as well tell you the appropriate term. They're called demonstrative pronouns. Imagine saying an apple versus that apple, or this apple. You can also change them to personal pronouns. My apple, your apple, the team versus our team. It will really change the impact of your writing and make it that much more specific. Now, most people in the field of medical communication work with teams. And regardless of your profession, any big public document will have a lot of eyes and a lot of contributors. So we're always sharing documents and getting new versions back and forth. This practice is the thing that will save your life. But it depends on where you are in the food chain. Content freeze. Most of the rooms I teach in are not familiar with this concept. This practice is what they use in advertising and marketing firms, and when websites are set to go live, it's what teams use to make sure there are no surprises. What that means is that you put your document on ice. You say, "This is it." It is the less reactive cousin to those FINALs at the end of the file name. This is where you ensure that only one person is working on a document or a section of the document at a time. Simply put, knowing that every author has access to a document, changes can be made without the other author's knowledge. Those changes might not be tracked. The file name might not be changed with each update. Someone might think they have to wait for the handoff and not begin work. Others might become impatient or just find themselves with a free second to think about the project and change the document without communicating that they're now making changes. Any number of scenarios. Document management software is designed to make this process more transparent, and yet we can still feel hijacked by our collaborators. Instituting a content freeze helps contain the number of simultaneous versions when working with a team of authors. Someone, typically the project lead or the senior writer, calls it. The freeze might not apply to the whole document. It could simply include certain sections that can be worked on simultaneously as long as only those sections are modified. Where the time saving lies in this editorial practice is in not having to integrate all the miscellaneous changes introduced by people who are not you, and in minimizing the number of surprises that you could miss because you've already reviewed the work. Like I suggested, consistent use of content freezes could save your life, or at least lower some stress. If you're writing for yourself without a team, I call the less extreme version of a content freeze pie on the windowsill editing. This is where your document rests. You allow your brain to reset. You allow your eyes to rest. You allow time for a new mindset to arise so you can approach this document fresh. If you can let the document sit overnight, that's ideal. We rarely have that luxury, but at least stand up, step away from your computer, take a break, and come back after a spell. Maybe help yourself to a piece of pie. That's content freeze in all its delicious forms. The next solution is proofreading. Proofreading is the most overlooked and intentionally avoided practices when editing one's own work. You've already read it 1,000 times. Do you really have to read it again? And the goofy thing about proofreading lies in the name. It's not actually reading. It's more symbol recognition. It's part of what we call mechanical editing, looking at formatting, layout, punctuation, increasing readability and comprehension by correcting obvious mistakes and inconsistencies. It's not about tone or voice or even good writing. It's all about seeing what is there and recognizing, recognizing what isn't supposed to be. Plus, you know that if you start reading that thing again, you're going to start editing. That editor brain looks for every opportunity to take over. Which brings me to an important distinction, a cognitive distinction. Think of writing or the drafting phase as being in the lab, coming up with the great ideas, mixing everything together, making connections as you go. In editing, we're finessing the language, making strategic cuts, focusing on the flow of information. In proofreading, we're scrutinizing the work. It's a different brain activity altogether. As I mentioned, it's very mechanical. So we face two challenges when proofreading. First, how do we change our mindset to approach the work as a proofreader and not as a writer or an editor? And second, where do we find the time? Proofreading is the part of the process that everyone thinks they can skip. And it can add time to the process. This is part of the reason I suggested all those other time-saving practices like outlining and content freezes, so you always make time for proofreading. I commented earlier that some people make their career by cutting and pasting between documents. This is exactly why proofreading becomes so essential. Many mechanical mistakes can be introduced in the name of saving time. When writing on a team and across disciplines, I've learned the hard way that you never want to publish or submit a document that hasn't been proofread. Spell check won't catch everything, perfect it or Grammarly won't catch everything, and neither will AI. Here's an example of what happens when we don't proofread. And this is from the British Medical Journal. This is a high impact journal. They have editors there. And here's another. We're looking for consistency, not simply because we're perfectionists. Documents need to be consistent because our readers have expectations. Cognitive compensation aside, our audiences are smart professional people who expect our communications to be equally smart and professional. Inconsistencies, even these minor ones, cause readers first to question themselves, did I read that right? And then to question the writing, the skill of the writer, and ultimately, the legitimacy of the science. We want readers to be with us in the ideas and not get lost in the presentation of the ideas. As mentioned, many of us are in a profession where the placement of a decimal point affects whether somebody gets a therapeutic dose or a dose that will kill them. Even with our best efforts, we make mistakes. More benignly, simply cutting and pasting can introduce errors. This is our profession. Whether we anticipated it or not, writing has become one of our main professional pursuits, and our brains are working against us. We need to outsmart our own brains. Like I said in the beginning, all of this has to do with how we change our minds, right? And some of it is to change our minds just to accept what might be de rigueur or actually evolving as a convention in American English. And it is in how our brain approaches the work. And this hopefully seems a little obvious now that we are shifting our minds a little bit on every front. So hooray for that. But here we are. How to edit your own work. Let's do a little high order thing. Reverse outlining. Again, you can do it in Word. You can print things out. Again, look for those little nuggets, the things that maybe you want to skim over. Like cut those up and see, all right, maybe it's a flow of information problem. Bring it into your body, as we say in the theater world, right? You want to justify every word or turn on some Sinatra if that's your preference. Try a content freeze. Give yourself a break. Either call it for your team, say, look, this, I'm sending it to you and it's yours now. Nobody else gets to touch it, or however it works out in your team, or just get up, walk away, clear your mind, and come back to the document later. Of course, I'm always going to advocate for finding time to proofread. If you're saving time during your writing, then you will have time to proofread. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't leave you with some mantras, your new mantras. Less is more. Make things as simple as possible, but no simpler. And all leaders read, great leaders also write. Again, I want to highlight that quote by Dave Anderson. I've worked with scientists and medical researchers and clinicians for decades. And I truly believe the better we are at communicating our ideas, the more success we will have in our careers. A lot of us ended up doing this type of work, i.e. writing, accidentally. And we often find ourselves trying to figure out exactly how to go about this career that we've landed in. So thank you again for participating in this training today. I hope that you found it helpful. These are the high points to editing your own work. I'll be rolling out more online trainings from the trainings that I've given in person for years. But start experimenting with these suggestions today and see how your writing and your editing of your own work will shape how you think about not only your language, but also the message that you want to convey to the world.